The story begins with silence. A silence so deep that no map, no book, and no record in schools would speak of it. Yet once, in the heart of America, there was a place full of life and pride. A place built by black hands, carrying the dream of freedom. That place was Riverside. Riverside was not like the cities around it. It was not born from the power of the rich or the rules of government. It was born from hope. After slavery ended, men and women walked away from the fields, from chains, and from broken promises. They wanted land where they could live free. They wanted streets where their children could walk without fear. They wanted to build something of their own, and they did. At the edge of a river stood the first wooden houses. James Carter, a tall man with strong arms from years of hard work, hammered nails into the walls of his new home. He was a farmer, a man who knew the soil, and he said, "Here, we plant for our children, not for a master." His wife, Mary, smiled as their two little boys ran through the grass. Nearby, Sarah Johnson opened a small school in a single-room building. She was young, her voice soft but firm, and she believed knowledge was the key to freedom. "If our children can read," she often said, "then no one can ever chain their minds." She taught them not only letters and numbers but also stories of strength, stories of people who survived the impossible. By the 1880s, Riverside grew. Families came from far away, bringing wagons full of hope. A church was built, and on Sundays, the sound of singing filled the air. A grocery store opened, where neighbors greeted each other with smiles. Farmers sold corn, beans, and fresh milk in the market. The town was alive. But what made Riverside different was not just its buildings. It was its spirit. Every man, woman, and child walked with their head high. They had been told for centuries that they were less, but here, in Riverside, they were enough. They were more than enough. They were free. Yet freedom is a dangerous thing in a world that does not want to see it. Outside Riverside, in nearby towns, whispers began. Some white townsfolk did not like what they saw. They looked at Riverside's success and felt anger grow in their hearts. "How can they live better than us?" some asked. "How can they rise so fast?" Envy turned into fear, and fear turned into hate. Riverside did not know this at first. Inside the town, life carried on with joy. At night, lanterns lit the windows. Children played games in the streets. Weddings were celebrated, and new houses were raised. The people believed they had found safety. But shadows were gathering. One evening, as the sun fell and the river glowed red in the last light, James Carter stood at the edge of his field. He looked toward the woods and thought he saw movement riders passing slowly, too slowly, as if watching. He told his neighbor the next day, but the neighbor only shook his head. "Maybe it was nothing," he said. But James could not shake the feeling. Sarah Johnson, too, noticed changes. When she traveled outside Riverside to buy books, she felt cold stares. In the general store of a nearby town, a man muttered, "That black town won't last long." She returned home uneasy. Still, Riverside pressed on. They believed in tomorrow. They believed in the strength of their unity. But history has shown that when black people built something strong, someone always wanted to tear it down. The first sign came quietly. One night, the store of a Riverside merchant was broken into. Goods were stolen, the windows smashed. The town gathered to repair it, and people whispered about outsiders. But no one could prove it. Then, strange notes appeared. Messages left on doors. Warnings written in crude handwriting: "Leave. This land is not yours." Families grew worried, but the leaders of Riverside told them to stay calm. "We built this with our hands," James said. "No one will take it from us." But deep inside, fear was growing. Mothers kept their children inside after dark. Men stayed awake at night, listening for horses in the distance. What the people of Riverside did not know was that this was only the beginning. More eyes were watching. Plans were being made. And soon, the peace they had fought so hard to build would face a storm greater than any they had ever known. The silence of history hides many towns like Riverside. But silence cannot erase truth. And the truth is this: a town once lived, full of dreams and dignity. A town that would be tested in ways no one could imagine. The river still flows, the land still remembers, and the ashes of Riverside whisper to those who are willing to listen. This is their story. The days in Riverside began with the sound of roosters and ended with the glow of lanterns. The town was alive with work, music, and hope. Every corner of Riverside carried the spirit of people who had built it with their own hands. At sunrise, farmers like James Carter walked to their fields. His hands were rough, but his heart was strong. He tilled the land and planted rows of corn, beans, and wheat. His voice carried over the fields as he sang old songs his father had once sung in the cotton fields of the South. But here, those songs were no longer about pain, they were about freedom. Mary Carter often baked bread in the morning. The smell filled their home, and soon neighbors knocked on the door, laughing and sharing stories. Riverside was not just a town, it was a family. On the other side of town, Sarah Johnson opened her classroom. Children carried slates and chalk, their eyes wide with curiosity. Sarah's lessons were simple but powerful. She taught them how to read words like freedom, justice, and future. Sometimes she would pause and tell them, "Books are keys. If you hold the key, no one can lock you away." The church bell rang every Sunday. People came in their best clothes, singing hymns that rose like thunder into the sky. The preacher spoke about faith, courage, and unity. He told them that God had not freed them just to survive, He had freed them to build, to rise, to shine. The people shouted amen, with fire in their voices. Businesses began to grow. A small grocery store opened where families could buy flour, sugar, and spices. A barber shop became a place where men gathered to talk about work, farming, and sometimes politics. Women sold quilts, pies, and hand-sewn clothes. The town was proving something powerful, that black families could thrive on their own, without asking for permission. But not everyone was happy about this success. In nearby towns, white farmers and merchants watched Riverside carefully. Some were curious, others angry. They whispered in taverns and shops, saying, "They are getting too strong." They pointed to Riverside school and church with envy. They feared what would happen if the town grew even larger. One evening, Sarah Johnson traveled outside Riverside to buy books for her students. She walked into a bookstore in a nearby town. The room grew quiet when she entered. The clerk narrowed his eyes, his voice cold. "Why do you need books? Isn't it enough you can read already?" Sarah stood tall. "Our children deserve the same knowledge as yours," she replied. She bought the books, but as she left, she heard someone whisper, "That town won't last long." Back in Riverside, people tried to ignore such things. They had work to do, and dreams to chase. But small signs of trouble began to appear. One night, James Carter returned from the fields to find a dead animal thrown at his doorstep, a warning. Another family found the word "leave" painted on their barn. The preacher's horse was stolen. Still, the people of Riverside held on to hope. "We will not run," James told his neighbors during a meeting at the church. His voice was steady. "We built this town with our sweat. If we leave, they win. And our children will grow up with nothing." The crowd murmured with agreement. Sarah added softly, "If we stay together, they cannot break us. They may burn wood, but they cannot burn truth." Her words gave them strength. Yet, the whispers outside grew louder. Newspapers in nearby towns began printing lies about Riverside. They said the people were wild, dangerous, or plotting to take land that did not belong to them. These lies spread quickly, feeding fear and hate. Riders from outside town started circling at night. Families locked their doors earlier. Fathers sat on porches with rifles, watching the darkness. Mothers told children to stay close. The peace of Riverside began to feel fragile, like glass ready to crack. But even as the storm built around them, the people of Riverside still found joy. They held music nights where fiddles and banjos played, and young couples danced under the stars. They held harvest festivals where neighbors shared food and laughter. In those moments, they believed nothing could destroy them. Yet in history, joy often lives side by side with danger. And danger was closer than they knew. For every song sung in Riverside, someone outside clenched their fists. For every new home built, someone whispered, "They must be stopped." The town was rising, but shadows were rising too. And soon, Riverside would learn that dreams built by hands could be torn apart by hate. Darkness was falling over Riverside, not only in the sky but also in the hearts of its people. What once felt like a safe town now carried the weight of fear. Families who had worked so hard to build a future now slept lightly, waking at the sound of horses, of footsteps, of whispers outside their homes. James Carter noticed the change first. He often stood at the edge of his fields in the evening, looking out toward the trees. More than once, he saw riders moving slowly in the distance. They never came into the town, but they watched. Their silence was more frightening than their words. One night, James gathered some men in the church basement. "They are planning something," he told them. "I see them out there. They are waiting for the right time." The men nodded, their faces tense. "What do we do?" one asked. James spoke firmly. "We stay ready. We protect our homes. But we will not run. This land is ours." The men agreed, but deep inside, fear was already growing. Sarah Johnson also saw the signs. Her classroom, once full of laughter, now carried a different mood. Children whispered about noises they heard at night. One little girl raised her hand and asked softly, "Miss Johnson, will they burn our school?" Sarah's heart sank, but she smiled bravely. "No," she said. "This school is strong, and so are we." Yet when she closed the door that evening, her hands shook. The first strike came quietly. A small fire burned down the barn of the Williams family. No one was hurt, but everyone knew it was not an accident. When the sheriff from a nearby town was told, he only shrugged. "Maybe you people should move on," he said coldly. His words cut deeper than the fire. Soon, other families were threatened. Notes slipped under doors. Rocks thrown through windows. Horses let loose in the night. A sense of dread filled the air. Still, Riverside tried to live as normal. On Sundays, they sang louder in church. In the fields, they worked harder. At night, families gathered to tell stories to their children, pretending everything was fine. But the truth was clear, shadows were closing in. James Carter's wife, Mary, begged him one night. "Maybe we should leave," she whispered. "We have children to think of." James placed his hand on hers. His voice was heavy. "If we leave, where do we go? We built this with our blood. If we walk away now, we will always be running." Mary had no answer. Tears filled her eyes. The hate outside Riverside grew louder. In nearby taverns, men spoke openly about destroying the town. "They're getting too rich," one said. "Too proud." Another slammed his fist on the table. "We'll show them their place." News reached Riverside of meetings being held in secret. Groups of men, armed and angry, were preparing for something bigger. Then came the night of terror. Sarah Johnson was walking home from the schoolhouse when she saw smoke rising in the distance. Her heart froze. She ran and found a neighbor's home burning, flames lighting up the sky. Men on horseback shouted curses as they rode away. The town rushed to put out the fire, forming a line with buckets of water. The family inside barely escaped. Their home was gone. The people gathered in the church that night, their voices filled with fear and anger. "They want to wipe us out," one man said. "We can't stand against them." Sarah stood up, her voice steady but full of fire. "We cannot let them destroy us. If we leave, they win. If we give in, our children will have no future. We must hold on." James Carter rose as well. "We are not slaves anymore. This land is ours. We will fight for it if we must." The crowd murmured with both fear and courage. They knew a storm was coming, but no one knew how terrible it would be. Outside, in the darkness beyond the river, plans were being made. Weapons were gathered, torches prepared. Hatred was ready to strike. And Riverside, the town built by hope, stood waiting, unaware that its greatest test was just days away. The shadows had grown. Now they were ready to become fire. The night was quiet, too quiet. A heavy moon hung in the sky above Riverside, shining on the rooftops and the river below. Families sat inside their homes, lamps glowing faintly, children drifting into sleep. But beneath the calm, fear pressed against every heart. The people of Riverside felt it. Something was coming. James Carter sat on his porch, a rifle leaning against the wall beside him. His eyes scanned the dark woods. Mary put the children to bed, whispering prayers over them. James clenched his fists. He had seen the riders in the distance for too many nights. Tonight felt different. Far away, a sound broke the silence: the crack of a whip, the stomp of horses, the roar of voices. James stood quickly, his breath sharp. Torches appeared at the edge of the trees, one after another, like fireflies turning into a storm. "They're here," James whispered. Within minutes, the riders poured into Riverside. Dozens of men, their faces covered, shouting curses and threats. The glow of torches lit the streets as the mob moved like a river of fire. The first strike came against the grocery store. Glass shattered as the men smashed windows and kicked down the door. Flames rose as a torch was thrown inside. The store that had fed the town now burned, smoke rising into the night sky. Screams echoed as families rushed out of their homes. Mothers clutched their children, fathers tried to guard their doors. Horses thundered down the streets, their riders laughing and shouting. The church bell rang, not for worship, but as a desperate warning. People ran toward the sound, hoping to find safety. Sarah Johnson stood at the church steps, waving her hands. "Come here. Stay together," she shouted. Her voice shook, but her spirit did not. But the mob saw the church too. "Burn it," one of them yelled. Flames were thrown against the wooden walls. The church, the very heart of Riverside, began to glow with fire. The hymns once sung there now seemed to rise in smoke. James Carter shouted over the chaos. "Get to the river. Save the children." He grabbed his sons and pulled them toward the water. Mary followed, clutching a blanket filled with food. Around them, neighbors screamed as fire spread from house to house. Sarah tried to lead the children out, her arms guiding as many as she could. But smoke filled the air, thick and choking. The fire spread so fast, it seemed as if the very night had turned against them. One family's home exploded in flames as the mob cheered. Another man, trying to defend his door, was beaten and dragged away. The cries of women and children filled the darkness, mixing with the laughter of the attackers. James reached the edge of the river and looked back. His heart broke. Riverside was burning. The store, the church, the school, all of it was being swallowed by fire. The dream they had built with their hands was being destroyed in a single night of hate. Sarah stumbled toward the river with a group of children, her face covered in soot. She fell to her knees, coughing, but she pushed the children forward. "Run," she begged. "Don't look back." Flames lit up the sky, brighter than the moon. The heat was unbearable, the crackling of fire louder than prayers. Families hid in the trees, watching as everything they loved turned to ash. James held Mary and their boys close. His voice trembled with rage and sorrow. "They want us erased. They want us gone." Sarah, standing beside them, whispered, "But we are still here." Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes burned brighter than the fire. By dawn, Riverside was gone. The streets were blackened. The school was a pile of charred wood. The church bell lay melted in the ashes. Homes that once stood tall were nothing but smoke and rubble. The mob had vanished, leaving silence behind. The silence was worse than the screams. It was the silence of erasure, of loss too great to speak. Survivors stood together by the riverbank, their clothes torn, their eyes hollow. They had lost everything: their homes, their safety, their dreams. But they were still alive. James looked at the ruins of his farm, his hands trembling. "We built it once," he said slowly. "We can build again." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "They can burn our town," she whispered, "but they cannot burn our story." And so, in the ashes of Riverside, hope still flickered like an ember. But history would try to bury that ember in silence. The night of fire had destroyed Riverside. But the memory of it, the truth, was still waiting to be told. The smoke of Riverside slowly faded into the sky, but the scars it left on the people never disappeared. The town that had once been full of music, laughter, and pride now lay in ashes. Families stood at the riverbank with nothing left but the clothes on their backs and the memories in their hearts. For days, survivors searched the ruins. Mothers dug through blackened wood to find pieces of their homes. Fathers lifted heavy beams, hoping to recover tools or keepsakes. Children cried, asking why their beds, their toys, their schools were gone. But most found nothing. The fire had eaten everything. James Carter walked through what was once his farm. The fields were still there, but his house was gone, his barn destroyed, his animals scattered. He fell to his knees, pressing his hands into the soil. "This land remembers us," he whispered. But deep down, he knew the land alone could not protect them from hate. Sarah Johnson stood before the ruins of the schoolhouse. The chalkboards had crumbled, the books had burned. Only a cracked slate remained, half buried in the ash. She picked it up and held it close to her chest. Tears streamed down her face. "Knowledge does not burn," she said quietly. "We will teach again." But even as the survivors tried to gather strength, the world outside turned its back. When news of Riverside reached nearby towns, the story was twisted. Newspapers called the fire an accident or blamed the victims themselves. Some wrote, "The Negro town brought trouble upon itself." The truth of the attack was buried under lies. No one came to help rebuild. No government officer came to protect the survivors. Instead, silence covered the ruins like dust. It was as if Riverside had never existed. Many families had no choice but to leave. They scattered across America. Some went north to cities like Chicago, others west to places like St. Louis. They carried only fragments of their past, a family Bible, a quilt, or a broken piece of furniture. They carried their memories, but no one wanted to listen. James Carter and his family moved to another town, starting again from nothing. He worked as a laborer, carrying bricks and lifting stone. But every time he passed a field, he thought of Riverside, of the soil he had once called his own. Sarah Johnson continued to teach, though never again in a town that was fully theirs. She carried the cracked slate wherever she went, using it to remind her students that history is not only what is written in books but also what is hidden, erased, or ignored. Years turned into decades. Children grew into adults. The survivors of Riverside told their stories quietly around dinner tables or at family gatherings. But as time passed, many voices faded. The world forgot. Yet history does not stay buried forever. Generations later, young researchers began asking questions. They searched old maps and noticed a blank space where Riverside had once stood. They dug through dusty records, finding hints of a town that had thrived and then disappeared. In the soil near the river, they uncovered broken bricks, melted glass, and rusted nails. Each piece whispered of lives once lived, of homes once filled with love. Slowly, the truth of Riverside began to rise again. Descendants of the survivors came forward. They told stories passed down from grandparents, stories of a strong town, of fire, of loss, and of survival. They remembered the courage of men like James Carter and the wisdom of teachers like Sarah Johnson. And at last, the silence was broken. Today, Riverside's story is no longer buried. It is told in classrooms, museums, and books. It is shared in voices that refuse to be silenced. The world now knows that there was once a black town that stood tall and proud, only to be destroyed by hate and then nearly erased from history. But the people of Riverside left behind more than ashes. They left behind a lesson. They showed that freedom is fragile, but also unbreakable. They proved that even when homes burn, hope can live on. As one descendant once said during a memorial, standing by the river where it all began, they tried to erase us. But we are still here. Our blood, our stories, our truth, it lives. And so, Riverside lives again. Not in buildings or streets, but in memory, in history, and in every voice that dares to tell its story. The fire destroyed the town. The silence tried to erase it. But the truth survived. Riverside was nearly erased from history but not forgotten.